In the second video, we're going to look at how to import layouts into Simio, and we're going to look at using Trimble 3D Warehouse to download pre-built symbols that other people have developed. And so to do that, we're going to do a small example model, and the example that we're going to do uses the layout that you see here on the screen that I just downloaded from a random location on the internet. So what we're going to do is we assume we have this layout file. So I have the layout that you see here. This is a JPEG file of the layout, probably exported from something like AutoCAD. So I'm going to open Simio and a new model. And so the first thing we want to do is import that layout as a symbol. So I'm going to go to my Simio project, and over here in the library area you can see we have the symbols section, and so I'm going to click on that and then click on import symbol. So on import symbol, it's going to bring up the browser and say, what do you want to import? So I'm going to import this shop floor layout file. And then the import dialog is going to come up and ask me the dimensions of the layout. So this layout, it assumes, is 10 meters by about 6.28 meters. Let's make this just a little bit bigger. Let's go to 12 meters just to make the image just a little bit bigger. And will also let me set what they call the forward orientation. I can rotate that if I want. It's currently set up the way I'd like it to be. So I'm going to click enter, and it then imports the shop floor layout into our symbol library for the project. And so we can see that here, shop floor layout. So what I want to do now is place that symbol in our model. And so I'm going to place the model where the upper left corner is here at the 0, 0 point. So we can see in light gray the coordinates of the points. So I'm going to go to the drawing ribbon and the place symbol button, and there's our shop floor right there, and we can specify where to place the symbol. So I'm going to place it right here, as I said, in the 0, 0 point. And now when we zoom in, we can get the symbol perfectly lined up so the top wall is right on the 0 point and the left hand wall is on the 0 point here. And now we can see where the 12 meters comes in that we had with our scale. The next thing I'm going to do to simplify placing object is switch to 3D mode, and I'm going to click on the symbol and hold down the shift key and lower it just a little bit so I can have the animation objects on top of the layout. So I have it positioned, and the last thing I'm going to do for positioning is right click and select lock edits, which will prevent me from moving the symbol as I move around in my model. So we zoom in a little bit and we can actually see, let me close that, we can actually see our layout on top of our Simio model. Now that we have the layout imported, we can build our model on top of the layout. So I'm going to do a very simple model. I'm going to add a source. I'm going to make it a little bit smaller here. I'm going to then have two servers, one at the table saw, one at the drill press, and then I'm going to have a sink where entities leave. And so I'm going to again make these a little bit smaller so that we can see the layout underneath. And then I'm going to connect these up using paths. So I'm going to have my path from my source to server 1, from server 1 to server 2, and from server 2 to the sink. And I will then place my entities. So let's grab model entity and place it right here. And then I can execute my model, and we can see the entities flowing just as we would expect from server 1 to server 2 and out. So the first thing, I'm going to rename these table saw to match our layout, and drill press. We saw in the previous video how we could use project symbols to attach animation to the default entity and the table saw and the other objects. In this model instead, what I want to do is download a set of symbols from Trimble 3D Warehouse. So the first one I'm going to download is my default entity. I can do that and click on the download symbol, and assuming that you have an internet connection, what comes up is Trimble 3D Warehouse, which was originally Google 3D Warehouse. And what this is a repository for 3D models, and we can import these models directly into Simio. So I'm going to search for wood board. We have a drill press, we have a table saw. Clearly we're doing something with wood. So I'm going to select this one, and we can look at the model here in 3D mode on Trimble and on the Trimble website, and when we're happy we can say, okay, this is the one I want. I'm going to download that, and the model now is being downloaded into Simio. And so then what comes up is the same import dialog that we saw before, where we can specify the size of the object. So this object is a little bit bigger than I want, 1.5 meters. Let's make this about 1/2 meter. So this board would be roughly 1.5 feet. So that looks reasonable. And again, we have direction. The forward direction gives me direction of travel. So if I were to rotate this, say 90 degrees this way, the board would travel along the paths in that direction. So I don't want, I'm going to have it travel a long ways. It doesn't really matter in this case. And so now when I click OK and we go back to our model, we see that we have downloaded the 3D model for the board. And so if we look in 3D mode, we can see our default entity here is in fact the board that we just downloaded. And so when we now run our model, we now have this nice animation of the board entities flowing from the source to the table saw to the drill press and out. The next thing that I want to do is improve the animation of our table saw. So I'll follow the same process by selecting the table saw object, going to download symbol, and in the Trimble 3D Warehouse I will search for table saw. And we can search, and we can see that they're found several different table saws. Let's look at, say, this table saw. And so we can see the image of the table saw, and it looks reasonable. So we will download that. And as we saw before, Simio then comes up with the import dialog, and we can look at the size and make sure that the forward direction is what we want. And so I think this is how we want entities to move. So I'm going to say OK. And now we see that our table saw is replaced, or the table saw symbol has been replaced with the symbol that we just downloaded from Google, our Trimble 3D Warehouse. And so now when we run the model, we can see the wood board objects flowing through, and we see our table saw object that is now animating our server 1. So the next thing we want to do is we want to move the queues so that it looks like entities are being processed in the correct position. So when we go back to 2D mode, recall that a server object has the 3 queues, the input buffer, the processing buffer, and the output buffer. And so clearly what we want to do is we want to move the processing queue to be in the cutting area of the table saw. So this is, remember, drawing in 3D space. So the easiest way to do it, or the way that I find the easiest to do it, is to move in 2D to the correct position, then switch to 3D, and then use the Shift key to move in the Y direction. So I can hold down the Shift key, and then I can just move up, then switch back to 2D mode and get the board, or get the queue exactly where you want for it to for the processing location. So I now go back to 3D mode, and now the board is in the actual cutting position of our table saw. Now that the cutting position is correct, we can focus on moving the input queue also. And I'm just going to move the input queue assuming that it feeds directly into the table saw, which I don't have a device there, but for now we'll just pretend like we do. So I can again hold down the Shift key to move in the Y direction, and then switch to 2D mode and move the cue to however I want this to be positioned. And so when entities arrive, you can see that I probably don't have the correct Y position yet. So I'm going to go back to 3D mode, and now we can see that I did not raise the cue high enough in the Y direction. So let's do that. And watch entities arrive. And now it looks as though we can have one arrive here. There we go. And go back in 2D mode and then have them directly butted up against if we so desire. And we could do the same thing with the output cue and basically have the animation component or the location component look exactly as suited for the symbol that you download. Note also that we can move the nodes around. So if I want the entities to travel, I can have the entities travel along the path and travel right up to the table. So I need to do, again, the moving in 3D. So I'm going to move it in 2D space where I want it, then switch to 3D and move in the Y direction to get the correct location. So also when we look at the cues and the nodes, there's no reason that these have to maintain the standard relationship with the symbols from the default library. So I can move the output for the source 1 to the door, or what would be the door, I guess, and I don't have to have it connected directly to the source. Now note that when I move the source object itself, all of the components move with it, but I'm free to move the individual components around. And I can also do the same thing with the sink if I want the input to the sink to align with the door that way. So next with our model, we'll do essentially the same thing for the drill press. So I'm going to follow that same basic process of selecting the drill press object, clicking on download symbol, then going to the 3D warehouse and search for drill press and pick my favorite drill press that's coming up. We'll just pick the first one, Delta DP350 Shopmaster. So looks good. Click on download, then downloads into Simio. Simio then brings up the import dialog and allows me to set the size and the general rotation. So I look at this in 3D, zoom out a little bit, looks like we wanted a little bit bigger drill press. Maybe we didn't want a tabletop one, so let's make this a little bigger. Let's make this 0.75. Note when I change one of the dimensions that Simio maintains the aspect ratio, so I only have to know one dimension to have it set. It still looks a little smaller than we want, so let's go ahead and make this 1 meter tall. So now it looks more like a floor standing bench press than a tabletop bench press. So I'm happy with that. Click download, and then didn't want to move that. Move around a little bit, and now here our bench press is loaded. So now we need to do the same process so that we can have the boards being processed here in the process area. So I'm going to switch back to 2D mode and move in XY, and then go to 3D mode and move into, XZ, and then move into Y. So the Simio coordinate system, X and Z, is what you see in 2D mode, and then when you go to 3D mode, this is the Y dimension. And so now we can see entities arriving and entering into the processing position for the drill press. The last thing I want to do in this model, or to this model in this video, is handle this input cue to the drill press. And so what we've seen before is how to use regular cues, the line cues, and we've looked at point and oriented point cues. What I want to do is create or download a symbol so that we can store the input cue in a shelving system. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my model and symbols, and I'm going to look in 3D Warehouse to find an appropriate shelf. So I'm going to go to Trimble 3D Warehouse, look, oops, learn to type, SHELF, shelf, and I'm going to just scroll down and look and find something that looks like an appropriate shelving system. And let's do this 72 inch, 24 inch by 48 inch. This looks like something you might see in a shop. So I'm going to download that model, and it's going to then come up as we saw before, and it's going to ask me the dimensions and the orientation of the model. So here's our system that we have. Look at it, it's easier to see these in 3D mode, and so that looks like the appropriate size shelf that we would have. So I'm going to say OK, and now note that we have just downloaded this symbol. Let's go ahead and rename this shelf, but we haven't placed it in our model. So previously, when we did the table saw and when we did the drill press and when we did the wooden board, those symbols were associated with Simio objects. This time what I want to do is just place the symbol in the facility view. So I'm going to go to Drawing, Place Symbol, exactly like we did when we placed the layout. And this time I'm going to place the shelf, and I'm going to place it right here. Let me see, look at it in 3D mode, get it where we want. Looks like it needs to go over just a little bit more. Go slide it over just a little bit, go back to 3D till I'm happy, and it looks like it's up a little bit, so we'll lower it to where it's just sitting on the floor. And when we're happy with the location, we'll right click and lock edits, and now we can move around and the shelf won't move. Now, of course the drill press will move, but now the shelf is locked in place. And so our next step then is to align the input queue. So when I run my model, we can see the wood pieces coming in. And in order to help me do the alignment, I'm going to select and increase the processing time so I can quickly build up a queue. So I'm going to make this a bigger number. Let's just double this, 0.2, 0.4, 0.6. Now we shouldn't be able to keep up, and therefore we should build a queue. And so when we run for a little while, we see that we are building up the queue that we want. Now, in order to be able to align my queue, I'm going to change from a line queue to a point queue. And so now you can see that I have, as we saw before, I have 2 points, and then I have the orientation. And while it's running, I can move these around. And I can add a vertex. So we want to have, let's add 6 vertices here, or 6 places, so we can hold 6 things in 6 things visually in our queue. And so there we go. So now we have 6 objects, and so what I want to do is then align these so that they look like they're sitting on the shelves. And so this involves moving the 6 vertices to the 6 points in 3D space. So if we store 2, 2, and 2, we will have what we want. So I'm going to move everything over here, and then I'm going to switch to 2D mode and align first in XZ coordinates. Go back to 3D mode and align these guys. Select the queue and move in Z direction. Note that they go right through the symbol, so I want them to just line up at the bottom. Then I'm going to grab my next 2 and move those into position on the second shelf. So I go back to 2D mode and sort of position these in the XZ plane to where they need to be. Go to 3D mode and position these in the Y direction. So now they're sitting directly on shelf 2. And then finally go back to 2D mode and move our final 2 into position on the third shelf. And we of course go to 3D mode and move these guys around. So you got to grab the queue, oops, got to be careful moving in 3D space. Hold down the shift and move that one up, and then hold down the shift and move that one up. So now when we run, when we go in 2D, let's get zoomed back out a little bit and move our paths just a little bit, and we just assume that boards come in that way. And now we can stop and put our drill press back to the nominal speed that we know can keep up now that we have everything located. So let's go back to point 1, point 2, point 3. And as we run, we see the entities coming in to the processing area, and when we do build up a queue, they're being placed on the shelf. One final thing, if we go to the visibility tab, we can turn the links off, we can turn the queues off, turn the nodes off, and the labels, and links also. And now we see the boards coming in, saw moving directly over, coming to the shelf, then being processed, and then departing. So hopefully you can see that in fairly short order we can make a nice realistic looking animation without much work at all. Also, when we get to a further video and further module when we're talking about worker and vehicle objects, you can see how we can also have the technicians or the workers that move things around and that perform the actual processing steps. In the next video, in this module, we'll see how to use Google SketchUp to create these 3D objects for ourselves.